Thank you, Ralph, for pulling this together. I'm reminded of John Kennedy's quip at one of Jackie's galas where he said, "This is the greatest assemblage of talent in one room with the exception of when Jefferson dined alone." I go back to 1968 with Ralph. Bob Walters, our mutual friend and a columnist on the old Washington Star, introduced us, and he had me meet him on the corner of Connecticut and S Street, and Ralph was going to meet us there, and Bob showed up in a Corvair, and Ralph would not get into the car, and so we walked to Ralph's favorite Middle Eastern restaurant, and that was the beginning of a great friendship. In 1943, Michel Kalecki, who was an economist, Polish-born economist, who was a protege of Keynes, who sort of positioned himself midway between Keynes and Marx, wrote a famous essay called The Political Economy of Full Employment. And Kalecki conceded that as a matter of economics, Keynes was right. You could harness capitalism in the public interest by regulating it and by using macroeconomic policy. But as a matter of politics, the capitalists would never let you do it. Now, in the post-war era, which was the subject of my last book, it looked as if Keynes had won the argument with Kalecki. Capitalism was housebroken. And for a remarkable period of about 40 years, the economy not only grew at record rates, but it grew more equal at record rates. And then the capitalists came roaring back. And ever since the late 70s and Reagan and Thatcher, we have turned the capitalist economy back into a predatory economy run by and for capitalists. Now, I want to say a little bit about Ralph's career and a very polite disagreement I have with one aspect of his view of the world. Part of what Ralph has done, and he's done so much, has been to recognize the problem that Kalecki identified. If you're going to make anything like capitalism operate in a remotely public interest, you need a great deal of countervailing power. And so all of the consumer groups that Ralph organized, very ingenious things like CUBs, committees of utility subscribers, and the great piece of legislation that was killed at the last minute, the Consumer Protection Agency. This was all about countervailing power, so that when you devised forms of regulation, they were less likely to be captured, so that Keynes might once again stand a chance of winning that debate with Kalecki. However, one other facet of Ralph's wonderfully complex odyssey has been the efforts to make markets more market-like and more efficient in a kind of Brandeisian way. And here's the nuance of slight disagreement that I have with this. It seems to me that there is a realm in which we need markets. We need entrepreneurs. There are some things that markets do well. But we also need a public realm, a nonprofit realm, a civic realm. And the problem with the market realm is not just that it has been corrupted, but that it's too big. We need fewer market institutions altogether, because markets have this very unfortunate habit, as everybody from Marx to Polanyi to Ralph has demonstrated. Markets tend to take over things that they shouldn't take over. And you give them an inch, they take a mile. And so the project of trying to harness markets in the public interest, except in a fairly narrow realm, which is narrower than a lot of people think, is kind of a fool's errand. And the last 40 years proves that. Now, I wrote a book in 1997 called Everything for Sale, The Virtues and Limits of Markets, in which I tried to sort out what markets do well and what they don't do well, what it takes to harness them in realms where they could do things well, and where they need to be supplanted altogether. And 21 years later, I conclude that we need even a smaller market realm. Because if you look at what's happened in the past 20 or so years, Charles Schultz, Carter's chief economic advisor, wrote a book called The Public Use of Private Interest. Allegedly, you can take private interest, create incentives, and use the entrepreneurial impulse to achieve public goals. Well, that turns out to be mostly malarkey. And you've got so many case studies of this, from voucher schools to privatized highways to privatized prisons to privatized parking meters, where the power of the entrepreneur is such that the rules get gamed. And you have corruption introduced that dwarfs the normal sort of corruption that sometimes afflicts the public sector when the public sector is just doing a public job. You also have case after case after case where something that was working perfectly well when it was a public institution, like Fannie Mae, gets privatized and then gets corrupted and then gets complicated so that it's too transparent to regulate. You've got abortive cases of attempted deregulation, like airlines and trucking and electric power, where the logic of some progressives in that era was, okay, the agency has been corrupted to a point where the only remedy is capital punishment. So let's kill the agency, and then let's place our faith in competition. I think that proved to be naive about the potential power of industry to game the rules. And so instead of intensified competition, you've gotten hyper-concentration. And we've seen this in industry after industry after industry, where the airlines have been the absolute world champions at gaming the bankruptcy laws. I think every single one of them has gone bankrupt and then reemerged from bankruptcy more profitable than ever after shedding pension obligations and other things that served a broader public interest. You've got other cases like Social Security, which is as simple as it could be, which is better, more efficient, more equitable than any kind of pension system, let alone 401ks and IRAs and KIOs that the public, so that the private sector comes up with, and has much less looting by intermediaries because there are no intermediaries. It's just the government and the pensioner receiving Social Security. We've got the case of Medicare, which is more efficient than any private sector counterpart, and on and on and on. So I guess my one-liner here is, yes, to the extent that we have market institutions, which we need for part of the economy, because there are some things that markets do well, let's have them as honorable and as uncorrupted and as transparent as they can possibly be. It's a pleasure to be here with Bert Forward, because clearly resurrecting and modernizing concepts of antitrust so that they can not only go after traditional abuses, but also go after new abuses that Senator Sherman could not have thought of by platform monopolies, absolutely. But there are cases where public purposes and economic purposes are not only served more equitably, but are served more efficiently when you simply have the public realm providing the service. Chattanooga, Tennessee, this may be partly the legacy of the TVA, another example of how public does something more efficiently and less corruptly than private. Chattanooga has public internet service, and it's cheaper, it's faster than anything else in the country. There may be a few others that are comparable to it, but as a consequence of this, Chattanooga uses the fact that it's got very fast, very efficient, very cheap internet service as a strategy of economic development to attract industries that need fast, efficient, and cheap and reliable internet service. There's no reason whatever for that not to be a public utility. And the same, by the way, with finance. If you look at what banks actually do, the era after Roosevelt finally regulated them, banks in effect were one step away from public utilities. They might as well have been public utilities, and savings and loans as well. They were regulated in terms of conflicts of interest. They were regulated in terms of interest they could charge, interest they could pay, and there were no bank failures in that era. So I think yes, on the one hand, we need to think very hard about making markets as honorable, open, and efficient as they could possibly be. But we also need to think hard about shrinking the market realm altogether to introduce a whole new generation of public options, both because they're more efficient in their own right and because they teach an ideological lesson that the things that we do as citizens via democratic government are often not only more equitable, but more efficient than things that we entrust to markets. And of course, the other tremendous element of this is corruption. We now have private sector corruption and public sector corruption feeding each other, nourishing each other, and contributing to the kind of cynicism that gave us Donald Trump. Bill was quite eloquent in describing the default of the Obama administration. And when you can't really tell the difference between a Republican administration and a Democratic administration, in this case, the Republican administration, Bush 1, was actually better on bank regulation in some respects than Obama was. At that point, the public just throws up its hands and doesn't find any credible champion for the frustration that people feel. And so when somebody like Trump comes along and says, blow it all up, he actually has more credibility than the mainstream parties. So I think the other reason to restore a much greater role for the public realm is that when you have a smaller market sector, you are less likely to get the hyperconcentration of wealth that leads to the hyperconcentration of power, that then leads to the rigging of rules and the collusion of both parties with Wall Street against the interest of ordinary people. Hillary Clinton did herself in many respects, but one of the most powerful ways that she did herself in was to take honoraria that she didn't need from the biggest Wall Street banks in the country. How could she possibly have done that? Well, it's a emblem of the corruption of the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, and it gave Trump an opening. So if we're going to have progressives to put forward a very different story, narrative that connects to the frustrations of ordinary people, they have to be as far removed as from that world as they possibly can be. And I think we've talked about public options, we've talked about strengthening the public sector, but I think we need to go beyond some of the assumptions about, yes, of course we want to clean up markets, we want honest markets, we want regulated markets, but maybe we need a smaller market realm altogether. Now, some people would call this socialism. And it's really interesting that Bernie Sanders dared to call himself a socialist, and that was actually a plus for a lot of younger people. When I give a book talk about managed capitalism, invariably somebody puts up their hand and says, well, why would you want to have managed capitalism? Why not have social democracy or socialism? And I think the title of my last book was, Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? I think if democracy is to survive, it's going to require a much smaller realm of capitalism and a much larger realm for public institutions and public activities. Whether that balancing act is politically possible, that's a very good question. And I think that will take both extraordinary political leadership and a ton of grassroots organizing and a lot of intellectual acuity. And I hope to hear more of that at today's conference. So thank you, Ralph. Thanks to all of you.